Okay, everyone, we should get started. It's game time. All right, our next panel is Demystifying Globalization, Michael Jordan and Global Capitalism. I was almost going to say demystifying Michael Jordan, but that wouldn't work. Our presenters, you already know, are Jessica Wang and Sayuri Shimizu.
Thank you. So our remit was to reflect upon the book Michael Jordan and the New Global Capitalism, and also a major address that Walt gave on technology and American foreign relations, which he delivered at the Schaefer meeting in June of 1999. So this was just days before the official release date of the Michael Jordan book. So these two works really went closely together. But before delving into the work itself, and I'll focus mainly on the Michael Jordan book here, I think we should be clear about the man himself, that of course, as we've already heard a bit here and there, Walter Lefebvre loved sports. And his students, his friends, his family members, most of all, can attest to that fact. And I will just tell one illustrative story here, although I got many good ones as we were working on the essay, that Sandy Lefebvre wrote and told us about how on the very first morning of her very first visit to Walkerton, Indiana, Walt's hometown, as we've heard, Walt rousted her out of the bed early because he had tickets to a Cubs game and they had to catch the train to Chicago. So Walt, he was, of course, a lifelong Cubs fan. He was an aficionado of college football and basketball as well. There is one fact we censored from our essay, but I'll share it with you here. Later in life, Walt became a fan of the New York Yankees. Yes, that is the proper reaction because I'm partly from Boston, so about this factor of Walt's life, let us say no more. But when it came to writing Michael Jordan and the New Global Capitalism, though, to our surprise, or at least my surprise, maybe Sayuri already knew this, we learned from Suzanne, Walt and Sandy's daughter, that Walt was actually not particularly enamored of NBA basketball. So the Michael Jordan book was really about his intellectual curiosity, a curiosity about the power of sports, corporate capitalism, marketing, branding, mass media, and consumerism, and how these things came together to represent and to shape the image of the United States and its presence abroad. His interest in technology also, in the essay that we looked at, at one level, that essay is a perfect example of that Walt technique of working through biography. So he was so interested in particular visionaries such as John Quincy Adams, there I made my plug, and how they saw the world and tried to actively shape the world. And the technology essay uses a similar technique of focusing on three secretaries of state, Seward, Elihu Root, and George Shultz, and sort of their very early and prescient interest in technology, technologies that shrank distance. They were all three of them in their own respective time periods were particularly interested in communications technologies and their implications. And so in that essay, he uses these three figures in order to explore the intertwining of innovation, particularly in the form of information technology and communications, social organization, the new size and reach of business enterprise, and all the ways in which corporations were able to mobilize social organization and new technologies. But he examined the intertwining of these trends with the evolution and deployment of US power around the world. Now, he was writing about these subjects at a time point when history of capitalism was really not in vogue yet in the late 1990s, that it took not just the end of the Cold War, but also the volatility of capitalism demonstrated by the 2008 financial crisis to really revive much more open discussions about capitalism that have made the history of capitalism into what is these days a kind of hot commodity in academia as well as among public intellectuals. But Walt and also the Wisconsin School more generally, they were doing history of capitalism long before this subject became popular. And in fact, they were doing it at a time, as we've already discussed, when it was somewhat politically risky to write in a critical vein about capitalism and its expansionist capitalism and its expansionist imperatives, which of course was what William Appleman Williams and the students in his orbits really started doing in a very forthright and daring way in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so, last night there was a certain amount of joking about Walt as the supposed radical and communist, which I think really, he was, someone earlier today pointed out, he was someone coming out of that prairie populist tradition who combined a kind of radical critique with conservative social values, which I think really is the right way to look at Walter Lefebvre's thought. But let us also remember, as much as we joke about the supposed radicalism of the Wisconsin School today, these were much harder times in the late 50s and 1960s, and it could be dangerous to say certain things that they nonetheless were willing to say and to think otherwise. So history of capitalism, it's there from the beginning in Walt's work. I mean, the New Empire was to a great extent about the history of capitalism. And then more than 30 years later, after that first book, in this exploration of technology, as well as his exploration of basketball field celebrity and sneaker-driven consumerist obsessions, he also wrestled with trying to understand what a globalized American capitalism had become in the late 20th century. And that in particular, under late 20th century capitalism, in the form of Nike's very agile organizational structures and globalized manufacturing facilities, combined with how the NBA managed to resurrect itself through marketing, particularly by taking advantage of the new age of satellite communications to turn NBA basketball into this kind of globalized image of excitement and athletic prowess. And then add to this mix Michael Jordan's own savvy in managing his image and attentively cultivating it. All of these were instruments not just of economic enterprise, but of US foreign relations. So basketball became a form of soft power, according to Walt's rendering. It was a way of captivating foreign consumers with messages of American energy and innovation and abundance. And this was an era also in which globalized media, combined with ever more sophisticated marketing techniques and advertising techniques, these shaped, as Walt wrote, the language, eating habits, clothes, and television watching of peoples around the earth. So that was Walt's case for understanding basketball as a part of what he called the new global capitalism. But in revisiting the book, one thing that struck me and Sayuri was the that concern with presidential power that had been of long-standing in Walt's work. That was the kind of countervailing development, the sort of anti-democratic possibilities of the state were on this other side of the coin of a fractious democratic society. Moreover, as Walt concluded in the Michael Jordan book, how do you get a viable social order at home? And as Walt pointed out in the Michael Jordan book, certainly the market alone could not be a guarantor of social order at home. And then moreover, when it came to 2001 and a new afterword he wrote for the book, the post-September 11th politics of fear, he argued, had also goaded Americans into accepting heightened secrecy and reduced government accountability when it came to the US policy response to global terrorism. So the book concluded, I think, very much on a darker note amid sort of the kind of giddying images of basketball-filtered post-Cold War American power that certainly defined popular perceptions of the Michael Jordan era and its global reverberations. And certainly we're going to talk more when we get to Richard and Eric about their discussion of the deadly bet, this changed political world that maybe was in some ways always in the making throughout Walt's career, but is so apparent to us today. And so, throughout Walt's work, we see a lot of writing about the dangers of excessive US power. But we're also living in an ever-changing time period in which we might also ask, but on the flip side, what are the dangers of seemingly ever-increasing US weakness? What kind of world do you get in that context? And I want to hand things over to Sayuri by closing on a cultural dimension of this question, namely the kind of globalized popular culture that we have today, K-pop and Squid Game and Pokemon and Bollywood and all of these things that all of my undergraduates are much more familiar with than I am. I mean, these different elements of global popular culture are in ready circulation in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And this is also a world, and I think Sayuri is going to say more about this, about how China's government was in 2019 very quick to shut down any signs of criticism that came out of the NBA after the general manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted in support of protesters in Hong Kong that year. So I want to close by asking Sayuri to reflect upon the following questions. If we were trying to write a sequel of the Michael Jordan book that would cover the last 20 plus years, what would that book look like? And what might we say about the workings of sports in US power or US popular culture and American soft power more generally, or this globalized, multi-centric, polyvalent world of popular culture and cultural power? What would we say about this changing world of culture and power in the almost 25 years since Michael Jordan and the new global capitalism first appeared?
Well, first of all, I apologize for sipping my Coke. I've been able to have only grand total of 4 hours of sleep in the last 36 hours. So I need to steady inflow of intake of caffeine. And so in that sense, this is my performance enhancing drug. So I would like to say, Jessica made a very, very wonderful, effective segue into what I like to offer in terms of a little reflection of what happened, what changed in the last 20 years when we talk about the intersection of global capitalism, sports, consumerism, and America's soft power. And both Jessica and I were totally deeply intrigued by the way how quickly the NBA walked back the criticism of China and what China is doing in Hong Kong in 2019. And since then, I've been sort of following the NBA and basketball. Baseball is my sport, so I never pay attention to basketball. But after the 1920 NBA that walk back, I have begun to pay more attention to basketball. And I have also noticed a very interesting phenomena. For example, this Enes Kanter Friedman. I don't know how many jocks there are in this room, but he's from Turkey, and then he's very famous for wearing these messages, anti-China, the pro-human rights messages on his Nike shoes, and then he became really criticized for what he does or he does not say. But he was very, very critical of Erdogan, the head honcho of the country he's from, and then also human rights, and he's very, very critical of Michael Jordan. And then also he's critical of LeBron James for being hypocritical about his kowtowing to Nike, which is kowtowing to China. So there has been a really interesting examples of the NBA player making decidedly, explicitly politicized message and wearing them proudly. And then NBA have to, as an umbrella organization, has to respond to the things that the players do, which may anger China, which also offers a huge market. And then really, as such, has an effect on the NBA's bottom line. So, and another thing that also, so this is one thing. So how are we going to, this U.S. soft power is going to really work in this, and it began to work in a different way in the last 20 years. And this is one of the questions that really intrigue us. And if Walt was still here, then how would he write about this change in the last 20 years and how U.S. soft power really, or the exercise of it, or diffusion of it, might change in the last 20 years. So that's one of the questions that we are commonly speculating on. Another thing is that, going back to the Enes Kanter freedom, one of the people that he criticized was Jeremy Lin. He was a Taiwanese American NBA player, and Kanter Friedman criticized Jeremy Lin for Jeremy Lin decided to play for Beijing Ducks in the 21-22, and he was criticized by Kanter Friedman for playing in a country that tries to hurt your country, or something to that effect, some Taiwan, mainland China binary thing. And I was thinking about this, that Jeremy Lin, he's Taiwanese American, but he was born in Torrance, California, and I don't think he even ever owned Taiwanese citizenship. So that really got me thinking about how fluid citizenship, or the imaginaries of citizenship, have become in the last 20 years, and then 20 years. And so, the fluidity of citizenship as carried by, or the imaginary of citizenship as carried by sports iconical figures. Another example that I noticed in the recent months is that after the World Baseball Classic, Japan won. So in the baseball, Japan is still a superpower. But then, so that all Japan team actually fielded 4 major league players, and 2 of them were not so-called pure Japanese. One is Dalvish Yu. He's a Iranian Japanese and something else. And another thing is St. Louis Cardinals, Lars Nootbaar. He's a half Japanese, but somehow then he played for the Japanese team. But it was very interesting. After that, he really made a name for himself during that successful World Baseball Classic. He started appearing in all kinds of TV commercials in Japan. And he is supposed to be, he's never been the Japanese citizenship, but somehow his being Japanese became so marketable in that Japanese media market or advertising market. And he started selling stuff as half Japanese guy. So Jeremy Lin, he's not Taiwanese citizen, but then get criticized for not being a Taiwanese citizens yet. So this fluidity, what we think of as a citizenship, and as it was carried by sports iconic figures, something that I just wondered how Walt would write about it, how he would make sense out of it. So this is the second point, and how the citizenship or imagined citizenship can be merchandised. And so this is the sort of clustered second set of questions that I would like Walt to engage. Another thing is also how the NBA also showed a very different attitude towards pushing back against China, as opposed to the NBA pushing up and even boycotting the Putin's Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. And then I was thinking about it, but and then in Russia's case, it's easy for NBA and American multilateral cooperation to punish Russia and then get away with it because after all, the American state was also imposing sanctions on Russia. So that was really this imprimatur of the American state and foreign policy goals, as opposed to China. It's not a target of American economic sanctions, so it's so much harder for American global multinational corporation to really participate in or even being drawn into that kind of economic punishment. So when you think of it this way, the different way that NBA responded to Russia and China really got me thinking about the question of the partnership between the American state and global corporations, and how that also feeding into the question of so-called American soft power. And finally, so that's the third set of questions that we would love Walt to engage if he was here with us. And the last thing that I would like to also point out is that so when China has been really this ubiquitous presence in the international global cultural landscape. And one way, sports is one, but also the Hollywood movies are another. I'm very attuned to that because my daughter is in that industry. She cannot work right now because of the strike, but she is in. So anyway, there have been a spate of works that came out about this point, how the China really shapes the cultural practices, market practices, and the content of the American film industry. One of them is Amy Koka's Hollywood Made in China. The other one is The Red Carpet by Eric Schwartznell. And this really is held at the China itself because of the power of its vast market, allure of its vast market can really shape the cultural practices in the United States and then the content of United States soft power as well. And that takes me to the question of this new concept of a sharp power that a lot of cultural historians and sports historians have been talking about. A sharp power is this situation where there's an authoritarian system and a democratic system. And this is a really asymmetrical, like a binary, that authoritarian system can really shut down information flow in the ways that they wanted to and shut down all the democratic messaging from there, but then they can go back and penetrate the democratic system because of its openness and its market-driven openness that they can also message their disinformation much more effectively into democratic system. And a lot of sports historians now think about what's happening to the NBA and then all the sports skate, international sports skate this way, that this is really basically the binary or face-off between China's sharp power and America's soft power. And it goes back to also the question that Andy raised in the previous session too, which system will prevail? The China's system that's shaped and driven by sharp power, or the United States system driven and shaped by soft power? And then I would like Walt to even see how these different systems of power really interdict or countervail, or is it going to clash So these are, I'm sorry that my speech is full of cheesy metaphor, but I just came out of a different symposium on baseball, and there were lots of cheesy metaphors. So I'm just sort of taking in all this stuff. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Occasionally when Walt and I would chat, and I always kid him, Wiley was his longtime publisher. So I said, gee, you must be rolling in all the royalties and whatever. So his eyes would roll a little bit. They weren't the most extravagant, and I guess that's probably true in the academic world. So then thereafter, and I wasn't sure how successful this book, but from the archives, I have the Korean edition of this book. And I'm not familiar, I'm not a linguist, perhaps someone might be in this room, but every word, with this one exception of the picture, in this Korean book is about Michael Jordan and Walt Lefebvre and things of that nature. Just kind of a little vignette in terms of which countries picked it up, who translated it, who did what to whom on that. And I'll be happy if you're looking for the archives, but when I saw the topic on the conference, I said, aha, we have this below. That's all, nothing particularly intellectually stimulating, but just as an aside. And I had mentioned it to Walter, and he said, thank you. You'll probably get another cup of coffee or another drink or something out of it. He says, it's not going to increase my retirement. Let me phrase it that way. So, thank you.
Hi, I have not read the book, but just for some more background, it's not just that it was Michael Jordan. The NBA capitalized on the fact that basketball is the most popular sport in China, over soccer, over everything else. And the deputy commissioner of the NBA made a concerted effort, and that's Mark Tatum, who's a Cornellian. And Mark, I believe, is part Korean. So that could possibly have something to do with that, but with the Korean edition. But my friend who worked for the NBA back in 2014 was in charge of development, went to Beijing and 14 different cities promoting. So the NBA was always invested in developing the Chinese market, which is probably why they acquiesced to the pushback, because they were not going to threaten that relationship that they had spent so much time, energy, people, resources, and money developing the Chinese market. So, and it's not just with Yao Ming, although obviously that was huge for them. So it's just really, it's just such a part of their culture, and it's been for a very long time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the book is very much about how, the development of the China market for the NBA was a very deliberate strategy. But I think, what we're seeing are maybe some of the unintended consequences of that strategy, though, that what it means is that the United States, or the NBA as a representative of Americanness, is not an entirely free actor there. It doesn't have sort of free reign in how it kind of continues to penetrate the market. And that's what we're seeing with that's what we're seeing with the more recent pushback, but it's a fascinating development in terms of what it says about the changing contours of power in the world. Because I think, when Walt wrote the Michael Jordan book, it was still kind of that early post-Cold War era. It was still a time period when it was hard to imagine a serious decline in US power. And I think, close to 25 years later, we're living in a very different world with multiple poles of power and a very kind of, to a great extent, unstable international system in a way that wasn't so much on the horizon in 1999.
I just have one more comment. When I worked in thoroughbred racing, that's when I learned how popular thoroughbred racing was in the Chinese community, and gambling. And the women are often in control of the money. And when I was working as assistant GM of an arena football team that played at Mohegan Sun, and what they would do is they would be busing the people from New York, the Chinese community. They'd open the building overnight. They'd have concerts. They'd open the arena overnight because that's when the Chinese market had free time, and they would be gambling. And that's where one of the people, they went to Macau. I mean, it's the gambling aspect is also huge, especially since the United States, unfortunately, has embraced sports gambling legally. So that's a whole other aspect as well.
Thank you. I'm Larry Glickman from Cornell's History Department, and the two most popular courses I teach are Sports and Politics in American History and History of American Capitalism, so this really hits my sweet spot. Thank you for great, fascinating talks. I guess I wanted to bring up the question of race again. You know, one of the points that Walt makes is that Michael Jordan, you know, there's a quote in the book about how Michael Jordan doesn't offend anyone, and sort of is a figure kind of in the, you know, in the genealogy of O.J. Simpson and other black figures who appeal to a predominantly white market, and especially in the context of the recent book by Teresa Runstetter called Blackball about the NBA in the 1970s when NBA popularity plummeted. A lot of people thought the game was too black to be popular, up there with the other big American sports and so forth. And her book, a lot of that book focuses on Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a very different kind of politicized figure than Michael Jordan. And so I was just wondering if, you know, how you see Walt handling questions of race in that book, and again, maybe how he might have done it differently today with all the new scholarship and so forth on these questions. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for your question too. So the issue of race is really one of the central the questions in historiography of sports history, as you know, Lawrence. And then I just came out of that other symposium that race was also talked about quite a bit too. And I just want to, so Michael Jordan, he doesn't really deal with the race per se in the book, does it? A little bit, but.
I mean, he does to a fair extent in the sense of all the ways in which Jordan was very much focused on developing his brand, right? To the exclusion of being politically engaged in any kind of oppositional way. That Jordan was not, you know, and Walt didn't discover this. This is out there in the literature on Jordan, right? That he wasn't going to do anything that would get in the way of selling sneakers. And Walt was, you know, he's critical about this. And he's critical about the global inequalities that were defining, you know, African Americans' prospects in inner cities in the United States. You know, he felt that, or he writes in the book about how, you know, sneakers, the desire for sneakers were becoming a focus of violence between children and young people, and that this was something that was, that Jordan and Nike were not really dealing with in a terribly responsible way. And he also writes about systems of labor, particularly, you know, the factories in Southeast Asia where a workforce, mostly women, was working under horrific conditions. And again, this was the sort of thing that Michael Jordan kind of very carefully looked away from. I think my reading of the book is that in some ways Michael Jordan is a perfect representative of late 20th century capitalism in that sense, of being primarily focused about the markets and its possibilities for generating wealth to the exclusion of more difficult questions.
to build up, the bounce off of that, the Michael Jordan being really the metaphor for binary black and white American, and it's all the social and economic contradictions that are represented in the black and white contradiction. I think that's how things were the things are set up in the Michael Jordan's book. And what I'm really interested in is that the last 20 years that American sports, as professional sports, has become much more multiracial. And so I think Jeremy Lin's case is a very good example. So it's not just that the black and white and all the social inequities can be really represented and iterated in this two binary, but then also what about Asian and also Hispanic? So that kind of a much more multiracial American and how that really projected itself into professional sports, and then how that magnifies a certain kind of social inequities that the United States. I think Walt, I think if he was to write a book now, then I think he would be much more attentive to not just the black and white binary, but American racial relations is more not just a binary, it's about multiracial layered hierarchies as well. So, and I know that he would be very attentive to that point.
I think that's absolutely correct. And to me, one of the most powerful quotes in the Michael Jordan book is Michael Jordan's own remark apropos of building his brand, where Walt quotes him as saying, "I never forget that Republicans buy sneakers too." And that in turn is complemented by a later quote towards the very end of the book, in which a reporter was responding to some comments Michael Jordan had made, attempting to, in a sense, salvage his image from all of the criticism he had received by, as Jessica says, building his own economic and financial empire upon what amounted to sweated labor, and particularly female sweated labor. And this commentary basically harks back to the 1988 elections, in which he said, "Mr. Jordan, you're no Muhammad Ali." And I think throughout Walt's career, one of his greatest strengths, and Richard raised this issue this morning, talking about Walt's ability to analyze institutions. One of Walt's greatest strengths was the way in which he would integrate institutional analysis with the role of individuals in the evolution not only of American foreign policy, but of American institutions themselves. Call it capitalism, call it free market, call it the mixed market, give it whatever label you like. But I think one of Walt's most important messages in the entire book is that this new global capitalism that he described could never have been built around a Muhammad Ali. It could only have been built around a sports figure who was as pliable, as accommodating, and as frankly self-interested as Michael Jordan.
One of the things that brings us back to the previous discussions about what is going on in Central and Latin America regarding baseball and how baseball has changed its philosophy, and that's having a bit of a backlash to the United States kids who don't have as many opportunities now because baseball found it economically cheaper for them to have academies in the Dominican Republic and other countries, because they used to be able to even sign them as early as 16, but it's from the profit motive. They just glommed onto that because these kids really see baseball as their only way out of poverty. And so they're taking advantage of that as an institution of having all these academies, specifically exempting the kids in the United States and the urban markets here. And in terms of budgets to play baseball, the equipment cost is much higher than having one soccer ball or one basketball. So there's a lot in terms of the economics of the different leagues and why and what is their motivation for the globalization.
Yeah, I guess, you know, the last couple of comments, I think what they bring to mind are all the ways in which, you know, the power of capitalism, of corporations to sort of shape the world in particular ways to generate wealth, you know, in the process of doing this, they also cover up different systems of inequality, and they help to perpetuate those systems. And, you know, that's not just in the Michael Jordan book. It's also in sort of neo-dependency, or right, and variations of it. And you know, it goes back to these questions about, you know, capitalism and power, and, you know, what kind of world do we have as a result, and what are the sort of things that, you know, normally one learns to look away from because of the ways in which power flows. And yeah, and I think part of, you know, you can see this in sort of very everyday realms, right? As you're saying about these basketball academies that that in some sense have outsourced the development of baseball players. Sorry, yeah.
As well as the movie theaters and whatnot.
Yeah.
Again, the whole capitalist, that's what's behind it is capitalism.
Yeah.
I've been trying to formulate this question, and so maybe my incoherent question will be a great way for you to go nodding like this at the end, and then we can be done. If it's as incoherent as it may still be in my brain. So I was listening to both of you, and I was thinking about this question of, like, how would we sort of update this book? And it strikes me that one of the most important developments of the last 25 years for these kinds of things is, yes, everything has become more global, and the United States is as influenced by the global as the United States influences the global. But it's also, and maybe Michael Jordan is a great example of the beginning of this, the branding of him as individual unmoors him from the NBA, unmoors him from the United States, unmoors him from everything, right? And so Sayuri's also talking about the fluidity of citizenship. So is this like now so fragmented that it's not really easy for us to connect it to these issues of state power or even institutional power? Is that kind of what's happening here? Is that does that mean we have to write a really, like, complete, we don't get to ask Walt to update it if he comes back, but we have to actually write a completely different book that maybe has completely different questions?
Could I just
I think Walt would add on to what he was able to accomplish in the Michael Jordan's book, and then I think it's going to be also a book about globalization, but it's a texture of the globalized world is very substantively different 20 years later, and I think he would really speak to that texture, different texture of globalization and global capitalism, and how the China's this sharp power capitalism. This is a concept used, set forth by Christopher Walker, and then I really enjoy that article too. But how that kind of different kinds of soft power will countervail each other, I think, and then how that will really constitute this globalized battleground. I think that's something that Walt might be interested in expanding on.
I think also, though, he would have found it very challenging theoretically to do this, right? Precisely because, his own scholarship had been so American focused and had come out of a world of US power. And so, the question, and, maybe, this is really the question for us because we're still around having to write this history, is how do we write it in an era of fragmentation and of decline, of U.S. decline, like certainly in a relative sense, arguably in an absolute sense as well. And what does that mean for how we understand both the past and the problems of today? It was one thing in the Cold War to take a very critical eye on U.S. power, on liberal internationalism and all of its hypocrisies. But when you see a world in which all of that's beginning to unravel, I don't know, is dismantling of that power, what are the consequences of that and what kind of world do we get out of it?
Just very quickly.
Just going to wrap up, but go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, this is just very quick. I cannot remember when in the 1990s it was, but Walt did tell me that the Michael Jordan book, he had put off writing for some time, and it was very hard for him to put it together. It would come out sometime later.
Yeah, I think Jessica's question about about U.S. power and the excess of it, but also the weakness of it, is a nice one for us to think about as we go take a break, and then we'll come back to talk about the deadly bet.